What is happening, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome back. It has been a long time since I've been in Old Blue here in the garage with the boys, and I am very excited to be back behind the driver's seat, the rightful owner of Old Blue. Some of you know what I'm talking about. Somebody had her on her joyride. They were joyriding around with her. Really quickly, I want to give a shout out to Ghost Dragon ZW. Thank you for being here tonight, as well as Adam Ambrose. Sunsaver, what's happening? John. Arlene, thank you for being here as well. And obviously, we got UFO Garage in the house. And Nights at Nightmare, thank you for being here. Facebook user, thank you. It doesn't say who you are, it just says Mr. Big Willie, so thank you for joining us. If you guys do not know, we are going to have Mr. Ron Felber here with us tonight covering the Mojave Desert incident. But there are many other things that he's known for besides just that, even though I'd say in this community that is what he is most well known for. But he's had many other works that he's done besides just this one. I think it mainly is a famous one here in the community for those that are drawn to ufology as a whole and the possibilities of what is in our great cosmos. Really quickly, guys, don't forget you have Ben and Joe this coming Tuesday. I don't know who their guest is going to be, but they've introduced that 1 hour quick segment, so don't please put it in the calendar. Don't forget about it. Ring the bell if you have not done that yet. Make sure to like, subscribe, and please share with a friend. That is a great way to spread the channel. That is how I have found some of my favorite channels over the years, as a friend saying it my way. Christina Bell, thank you for being here tonight as well. Michigan UFO sightings and paranormal encounters in the house. What's happening, gentlemen? Excuse me, Wayne. What's going on tonight? Also, really quickly, if you'd like to catch myself, Gemma Jade, and John Hudson over at SOR on the weekends in the After Hours show, you can catch us there. I'll be there tomorrow night at 11 p.m. Eastern. We're going to be talking spontaneous human combustion. I have to admit, I kind of thought there was nothing there. I don't know. Started to read into it a little more. Makes me a little more uneasy about getting heartburn, I'll tell you that. I'll explain more of that tomorrow evening there. And don't forget, next weekend, I obviously have switched up my times here a little bit. I'm now on Fridays at 10 p.m. Eastern. And next weekend, I will have John Music as my guest. We will be hanging out. We'll probably have quite a few of the listeners want to hop in there, and we'll be sharing just some ideas of what's going on in the community. What does disclosure mean to you as an individual? What does it mean as a whole? And really, what is disclosure? How do we quantify that? And then the week after that, I will have Sev Tag, who is she is full-time in MUFON, and she helps many experiencers get their story out, as well as just being there for them. Does a lot of behind-the-scenes work, and she's had a lot of experiences herself, and I'm very excited. Anybody that has not caught that yet can check out the Chad Smith podcast, as well as the Paranormal Chop Shop, who is on right now with Josh, actually. And they did a great segment with her last week there. So if you guys would like to check that out, please do. As well as SOR, don't forget about Mr. Dave Scott, manning the helm, Monday through Friday over there. Lynn Wallington goes on before the After Hours, 9 p.m. to 11 p.m. Eastern. And we would surely appreciate your support with all that we're doing over there. All right, guys. Without adding any more and without me rambling anymore, also give it about maybe 40, 45 minutes, and we'll really start bringing in the listener questions, anything you guys have for him, Mr. Felber here tonight that we can get in. We'll certainly try to do that. So really quickly here, let's pull this up. So Mr. Ron Felber began his career writing with articles based on his experiences for True Detective magazine, and went on to write 3 books in the classic Nick Carter series. Like his protagonist, Jack Madison, oh my gosh, I'm going to murder this name, I'm sure, the Kafika Society, and a man of intermediate value, Felber has worked as a deputy sheriff transporting federal criminals, and has, transporting, here we go, federal criminals, and has fought Golden Gloves. I'm going to ask him about that in a second. So he's actually got, like I said, quite a few other books, which I will allow him to explain when we bring him in. So Mr. Felber, I want to say thank you, first of all, for coming and hanging out here in the garage. Thank you for coming on. Thank you very much.
Glad to be in the garage.
Oh, yeah. Yep, the boys in the garage, they've got the old, oh my gosh, what is their classic? They would kill me right now. Hang on, I got a picture of it over here. They got theirs that they drive around. Let's get what is this one right here? What is that? I can't, see, that's a front profile. Whoa. Joe would kill me right now. This is, if he can ever get this car and drive it around, it's what he wants to drive. And it's funny because we created this little logo off. This was the first vehicle I ever had, right? Well, speaking of this, what was your first vehicle? Everybody connects, right? We all remember that first vehicle that we had that gave us the freedom to hit the road. Yeah. What was yours?
It was a Carmen Ghia.
I don't know that one.
Carmen Ghia was like a sort of a Volkswagen.
Okay.
Except it was a convertible. So it was a white convertible, black top, Carmen Ghia, and I'm going to tell you that was just such a great car, and I wasn't the only one that liked it, so that was the good news.
There you go. That is good. That's good to have. As you want to have a vehicle that everybody wants to take a ride in. That is a good vehicle to have. Yeah, the boys who are at the garage, they definitely, I don't know if you've ever looked into them or not, they keep things very light, very open. I think they do a great job in the community. As you very well know, you've been involved with ufology now for,
Yes.
well, I guess, what did you say? Let's start there. What was your break into the idea of even what ufology was prior to the book? Did you know anything about it before meeting the couple that we're going to get into this evening?
Yeah. Well, like a lot of people, when they grew up, I grew up with the Twilight Zone
Okay.
and Ray Bradbury and those kind of writers. And, H.G. Wells, Jules Verne. And,
Sure.
and so I was interested in just the idea of expanding imagination and different worlds and that sort of thing. But that's really where it began and ended. I didn't have any great interest other than, a sort of passing curiosity about
Right.
UFOs or alien abduction or anything like that. But I was open-minded about it. I was open-minded about it. But really what happened, was getting into the Mojave incident. And actually, I was running a corporation back then.
Okay.
And I had a salesman that was on the West Coast. I was in New Jersey. That's where the headquarters was. And we became friends. And when I was on the West Coast, I would go and have dinner with him and a couple of drinks, talk about business mostly. But he knew I was a writer. I'd published, I don't know, maybe 9 or 10 books already. And so he knew I was a writer and serious about it. And he said, I have a best friend that I played college football with at University of Redlands in California,
Okay.
who was an all-state football player. I said, well, that's great. He said, well, he's got a story that's really incredible. I really shouldn't be telling you this because he confided in me, and his wife confided in me as best friends. And outside of the parents, they really made a point of not discussing this. But they had this UFO alien abduction experience. So my first reaction, Willie, was something like, it's just not what I do. I was writing thrillers and I was writing Nick Carter stories. I was writing
Mid-series at the time, right?
different kinds of things. And so I wasn't really interested. And I figured this had been covered, But then he was pretty insistent about it. Said, these people are sort of dysfunctional. I mean, at this stage of the game, here's a guy, woman's a college graduate, he's a college graduate, all-state football player. He's in charge as project manager of constructing malls. So he had huge budgets, people working for him. So this was just somebody. It was really a sort of a very credible situation. They had 2 children. So I said, look, I don't mind meeting people. So, do you want to take me over there and have a conversation? I'd be delighted to do it. So we did. And when I got to know them even a little bit, the first impression you have are just very down to earth, credible people. And when I started to hear the story, I said, I'm not an expert on any of these things, but I've never heard of anything like this. I've heard of people seeing objects in the sky. I've heard of people saying that they were abducted by aliens. I've heard of those things. And I've also, heard about groups of people seeing things in the sky and whatnot. But I've never seen 2 individuals who had an experience that was sustained over many hours, that literally were pinching themselves, comparing notes, trapped in the back of a camper, and experiencing something more like if a veil was pulled, a curtain was pulled on another universe. And it to me at that point, I said, I've got to get involved in this because it's a story that needs to be told.
It's funny you hit on that. I shouldn't really say funny is probably the wrong word for it, but it is very interesting how each and every individual makes their way into this community. I have yet to come across anybody, and again, I always say I'm no expert in this field. but a Padawan, right?
Hmm.
But no one that I've met has been like from day one, just like, oh yeah, I was seeking out ufology.
Mm.
Almost everybody, it's found them, whether they're an experiencer, an abductee of some
Mm.
sort, or someone who stumbled, in your case, across a very down to earth couple. We could say your average Joe and Jane that
Yeah,
have just an almost out of this world phenomenal. If you didn't meet them yourself, one could say, reading your book, this has to be a work of fiction, right? This can't be reality that these people
absolutely,
experienced.
absolutely, yeah, yeah. And it's so idea of the intensity of it and the scope of it and the duration of it, and again to have not just an individual, but two individuals. So it puts away the idea of an hallucination. If somebody were hallucinating, let's say they took mescaline or something like that, you would have one experience and I would have another.
Yeah.
You would never have the same experience at the exact same time observing something. So that
Agreed.
was put out of the equation pretty early along.
Which, I mean, I appreciate that was something you guys had looked at too. Though, what was there some sort of a narcotic involved, and we're going to really get into the details of this tonight, or at least as far as you'd like to go with it. And by
Sure.
the way, I want to mention before we go any further here, guys, I'm going to drop this into the chat as well. But if you are listening back via podcast format, I'm also going to put it right in the chat. Any links that you would like for Ron and any of his books as well are all going to be linked in what I'm about to drop into the chat here. And if you are listening back on YouTube, you just scroll down in the show notes there, and it'll be right there available for you if you are interested. Because you do have a whole host of other things. My goodness, you got probably 20 plus books at this point, or getting close, maybe.
Yes, I'm getting close. Well, I published my first book quite a few years ago, and when I was 24.
24. It's a good
Yeah.
age, isn't it? 24 is a fun. That's a good
Now
time in
I'll tell
life,
you
isn't
what,
it?
it was a thrill. I promise you that, Willie. But so I did detective stories because I wrote for True Detective magazine because I was a federal marshal. I was transporting federal prisoners.
Okay. This
So
is
they had some incredible stories to tell as well. So
Yeah, no
I
kidding.
wrote those articles. But I also wrote Il Dottore, The Double Life of a Mafia Doctor,
Okay.
which was a nonfiction book. It became The Mob Doctor on Fox primetime.
Oh
And then,
wow.
of course, Mojave was done. Paranormal Witness did an hour show on it, and Beyond Belief did an hour documentary on it as well. So yeah, so I've been writing. I have a new book. I'm really looking forward to discussing a little bit. It won't be out till September, but the story was given to me by William Peter Blatty, the author of The Exorcist, when I was a student at Georgetown, and he was filming The Exorcist. So that's the latest, and it really falls very much in line with Mojave Incident because it's
Okay.
about the paranormal and it's about just things that are undeniable
Mm-hmm.
and yet inexplicable. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? So you can't say it didn't happen; it happened. But then you say, like, what does it mean?
Exactly.
What does it mean?
And I have such a love-hate relationships with things that do that because they absolutely fascinate me.
Yes.
But at the same time, like you said, even with this one, and now we'll get into it a little more tonight. Maybe there's some answers near the end there, but for a long time, and I'm sure certainly for the couple we're discussing tonight, there was probably a lot of unanswered questions. And it's maybe even starting with, I'd love to know, when you mentioned you first met them, what was that like? I mean, did they know you were coming over? I mean, we don't usually
Yes.
hear a lot about that interaction. Were they open to sharing with you, and how much
No,
was really
no, they
shared that
really
first
weren't.
time?
What happened was this. I mean, you've got to sort of put yourself in the shoes of somebody that's been through this. I
Hmm.
haven't, and you haven't. There are a lot
Right.
really like prisoners of war,
Hmm.
or with post-traumatic traumatic stress syndrome. So they really, after this happened, um, you know, I would compare it to somebody like the astronauts that went on the moon.
Hmm.
They come back to Earth and they say, like, so what? Whatever's happening here, I went to
Yeah.
the moon, man. Do you
Yeah.
understand that? So you talk about, well, we're going to build a mall here and we're going to construct the walls, and people say, like, what? I,
Right.
I saw a whole new reality. I saw a different universe that
Hmm.
exists side by side with our own. And you want to talk about concrete? You
Yeah.
see what I mean? Everything becomes very mundane. Everything becomes not so important. And what must be incredibly frustrating, Willie, is to not be able to communicate adequately your experience.
Yeah.
So if I'm trying to tell you something and I lived through it, it's a lot like combatants. They come back. How do you tell somebody what it's like to be shot at, to kill people, to have people
Right.
next to you killed? How do you really communicate that? Because it's not it's not an intellectual thing. It's a visceral thing. It's an emotional psychic sort of thing.
Yeah.
So to meet them for the first time, I think they were reluctant. I think they were tight-lipped. I think basically maybe they barely were convinced by Paul Moran, this sort of intermediate fellow, that this was a good thing. He thought it was good for me as a writer. He thought it was good for them to tell their story. But it was a little uncomfortable. But once they started telling the actual story, I have to say, I said to myself, this can't be true. This can't be true.
To yourself, like you're saying, you didn't say this out loud, but you were thinking it, right? Yeah, we've all been there when someone's telling that story, and you're like,
but we had them take polygraph tests. We had them brought to the Georgetown Center of Psychiatric Center in Washington, D.C. to be analyzed, to take tests to see if they were neurotic, to see if they were prone to fantasies. All checked out. We had them brought to North Carolina, where Dr. William Annixter, who worked with the FBI in retrogressive hypnosis, retrogressed them. So we knew that there were no mental problems. We knew there were no drug problems. We knew that they had no reason in the world to tell this story. They were afraid of losing their jobs. There's a guy that's in a very responsible position, handling $1 million budgets.
Wow. And that's something I always love to do for people who are listening to Gordy85. Good to see you, brother. He's just fascinating guest. Yes, Ron at Felber is always Ron, as I'll call it. He's always great when he's on. But let's set ourselves in that scenario. What year is this? I know the year that it took place, but what year are you meeting them in?
Yeah, I was meeting them in 95.
So mid-95. So the most that had really hit TV on a national setting, right? You had the Twilight Zone from back in the day, and you had the X-Files maybe around that time it was coming out.
Yes,
and that was about it.
Yeah,
you didn't really have, and it was always considered as the kooky idea that was in the corner. And for a long time they ran with that X-File music when they would discuss anything that was paranormal, certainly alien related, or ufology related in the mainstream media. So for these guys, for this gentleman to be running this kind of a company, maybe trying to get somewhere in the world, but I believe at the time he had 2 young children, I believe, around this time.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I mean, it had to have been quite a bit to try and come out and even open it up even to you and to a close friend, and what it was doing to them.
Yeah. And they're a lot like post-traumatic stress syndrome. I mean, they had insomnia. They couldn't sleep. Every creak in the house, every sound, disturbed them, because this didn't just stop, with this experience. They felt like they were watched for, months and years after that. So it's some quotes in the book that are pretty fascinating. But one of them is like the Steve Hess, who was the husband with his 2 children. What do you say to your children? What do you say to your wife when you can't protect them, when treacherous sort of situations are going on and you have no control over anything? You are absolutely at the mercy of this situation. And I think there's a huge frustration. I think there's almost a kind of humiliation, where you're helpless. And that's what I ran into when I first met them.
And I was going to say, and it can go for a mother or a father, but anybody has ever been a parent.
Yes.
That feeling of being put into a situation where you feel like you can't protect something that's so precious to you, your children. I think most people would say their children are the most precious thing to them in the world.
Yes.
It's terrifying. And I've never been in this type of situation, but we had a situation when my oldest was born, and again, not that long ago, where we were at the mercy of whatever was going to happen. And even the doctors were at that point. And I'll tell you, you feel so helpless, right?
Yes.
Nothing changes it. Money isn't going to change it. You're at the mercy of whatever ends up coming out of it. And so to know that you went through something like this, and as we're going to get into beyond even the one event,
Mm-hmm.
that's as a man or woman has to be absolutely just. I'll be honest. There's been times I've listened to the story, and we might even get into tonight where they talk about different elements that take place to them that are just so traumatic mentally
Mm-hmm.
that me listening to it is just my heart breaks a little. I'll be honest,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
I can't imagine. And again, I know in ufology and stuff, people are always we can't talk about the dark side or the bad side of things. And I'm not saying this is a bad thing, but I'm a big proponent of we should talk about the truth and we should share if things have
Yes.
happened.
Yes.
And it can't. There's balance in life, and it's not always rainbows and beautiful things, right? There's balance to
No.
everything.
Absolutely.
And in this case, as we'll get into in a minute here, this couple, and I believe 89 was that when the actual
Yes.
experience took place.
October 89. Yes.
So in '89, at the time, that's actually when they had the two young ones, right? And I've been there. I know they were getting ready to try and take a trip to get away,
Yeah.
right, for a little bit. We've all been there too.
The mother
Love
in particular. The mother in particular. I just want to get away from these kids for a weekend, right?
I don't believe them. My wife's told me that many times. And babe, I know you a break. We do. We need to get a trip out. We do. So they set up the I believe it was the grandparents.
Yes.
To watch the young ones. They said, let's just go out. Let's get out for a little bit. Maybe it did. Now, did they have like a camper or something? They must have hooked up. It sounds like.
Yeah. What happened was it was sort of if you've been married or have a relationship, it's sort of, if it's going to work, it's sort of compromise. So she wanted to go to just go listen to some music and dance and have a dinner and like that.
Have a good
He
time.
wanted to go hunting.
Oh no, he made the wrong.
Yeah. So basically, what they decided to do was to compromise. So there was a place called Whiskey Pete's that was near Midland Hills campsite, and this was just outside the Mojave Desert. And the idea was that they would go to a dinner, they'd listen to some music at this place called Whiskey Pete's, and then he would go hunting in the Mojave Desert. They'd camp out,
So
and he'd
funny.
get this mule deer that a year before he had missed. So he was with his father and his brother, and he missed a shot. And they gave him a relentless hard time about it. And so
As
he said,
one does, right? If you
I'm
miss
gonna-
the shot, you're gonna razz them a little bit.
I'm gonna go back next year, and I'm gonna get this mule deer. So that's what really, initiated this whole thing. But then they got to Mid Hills after they'd been to Whiskey Pete's, and Mid Hills is rarely sold out, but it was sold out, and it was the night. And you can kind of imagine this is a really desolate part of California, and moving into the Mojave, and they had no place to stay, but they did have a camper. They were in a camper, and so the idea was, all right, look, we can't get into Mid Hills. Let's go near where I'm going to be hunting. Let's cook up some steaks. We'll make a fire, cook up some steaks, and make a night of it, and then I'll go hunting the next morning. And of course, she was very reluctant. At the time, there were a lot of drug deals going on in the desert. Motorcycle gangs, etc., and courier drugs and have drug deals. And it wasn't uncommon to find a body turn up, in a dispute. And so she was really reluctant to just go out in the middle of the night into this environment. I mean, she wanted the campsite, but that wasn't possible. So right from the very beginning, there was this kind of eerie apprehension that something wasn't right, that things were on edge and not quite right.
Yeah. Which people always tell you that, right? Even we've talked about the different missing cases and stuff, or people talk about cryptids in the woods. They say, listen, no matter what, there's things in the woods, or you could say in the desert, that will kill you. Nature itself, if you're not careful, can take you out, right? So regardless of even maybe what ends up happening here, like you're saying, I think it's to approach the situation a little bit of trepidation. Probably wasn't all bad on her part. I don't know the specific area and what was going on at the time, but apparently he didn't really care. He probably was, I'm sure, armed. Obviously, he was going to hunt. So
Yes, yeah.
And he played football, right? Back
Yeah,
in the
no,
day?
this is a guy that you can just tell by the fact that he wanted to make it right. So he blew a shot, His father gave him a hard time. His brother gave him a hard time. And he said, I'm going to make this right. So he's a competitive sort of guy,
Right.
a guy that, that was used to winning.
And unfortunately, this evening definitely turned into not quite the. I'm sure that maybe even romantic plans that they might have had planned, right, to finally get away from the young ones
Yes.
out there running around them.
Well,
So as we come into this evening with them being sold out and they're cooking their steaks, I can imagine maybe a clear night. I don't know if it was or wasn't, but maybe
it
looking up at some
was.
of the stars. Oh, it was.
It
Okay.
was.
So they're taking their time looking at the stars, perhaps, and just enjoying nature. I would assume at this point, a little
Yes.
peace and quiet. Man,
I can give you even this is the setup. I mean, exactly. So they had the camper, so they made a fire. They were cooking up steaks, and they did. And actually, there are animals like desert rats, I guess they would call them.
Okay. Oh
And
yeah,
and
kangaroo
they're
rats,
yeah,
right? I think
and
that's
they
what
were
it said in the
feeding.
book.
They were feeding them actually. So they were throwing bread to these animals, and just sort of enjoying that, laughing about that. And then they started stargazing. So it was this incredibly clear night, as the desert is. I mean, that's part of it. And all of a sudden, they're stargazing, and Steve was sort of an expert at this. He was an outdoorsman, so he knew the constellations and whatnot, and was explaining them to Dawn. And he said, "You see that? That's a double star, and this is this." And she goes, "Well, if that's a double star, that must be a triple star, because there was a glowing orb that looked like a moon almost." And so Steve was a little shocked at that. But in the meantime, he sees that and he turns to his right, and there are mountains. There's the New York mountains, and Tabletop Mountain is in front of them.
Okay.
And from out of behind one of the mountains, he sees a UFO. It's about 30 feet in diameter. It peeks out almost like peeking at them, and goes back again. He doesn't want to tell Dawn that, because the last thing that he wants to do is talk about a UFO or some object that's very nearby that he just saw, because she would panic. So he keeps it to himself. But while this is going on in the sky, of course, this is very much on his mind. The one glowing orb turns into 9 glowing orbs.
Stars
And the
don't normally
9
do that.
configure over the mountain, which is perhaps 500 yards away or so, into a sprawling M configuration. So I'll do a little backstory here. When Steve was 9 years old, he went fishing with a friend. So he and his parents and another set of parents went camping. And so there was a lake nearby. And so they went to the lake, which wasn't far from the campsite, and were fishing. They both saw a glowing object in the sky. And at first it was sort of fascinating to the two boys.
Okay.
Then it didn't feel so fascinating, because they felt this sort of almost communication, this sort of telepathic situation.
This was when he was younger,
And
right?
he was young. This would be when he was 9. So they panicked and they ran. They dropped the fishing rods and ran back to the campsite. And of course, their parents are there laughing and having a good time. And these two kids come in and said, "Oh, we just were chased by a UFO," right? So nobody believed them. They thought it was kind of funny, but to them it wasn't funny. It was terrifying.
Right. When you're
And so when he saw this glowing orb behind the mountain, and when he saw the first glowing orb, it sent an incredible chill down his spine, because it flashed back to when he was a kid and saw this for the first time. So
now, had he even tried to talk to anybody about that experience prior, outside of what he mentioned to his parents at that point in time? Did he ever?
no,
No. So it
no,
was just shut down when he was younger, and he's just pushed that down in his memory,
exactly.
subconscious over
I
time.
think that's what makes it so terrifying, because it was shoved down into his subconscious, and all of a sudden you see the same thing you saw, I don't know, 30 years, 25
Right.
years prior to that. and it's startling. It's startling. And so that's pretty much where they were. But now when Dawn sees the wife, sees this configuration of 9 objects in this sprawling M, and sees them blinking. They start blinking as if in communication with one another. She goes, "These aren't stars. Something is wrong." And he goes, "Well, maybe it's a military exercise," because there was a military base, a couple of military bases, Nellis Air Force Base and another, I think it was 29 Palms, that were not so far away. So they said, well, maybe it's a military type exercise. And that satisfies them to a point. But then the 9 become hundreds. And every sound in the desert stops. And it's as if the whole valley is capped. And that's when things go south. So,
and that seems to be something we hear a lot. And it's not just in, maybe, some sort of a UFO encounter or anything of that nature. We're talking anything cryptid, anything paranormal sometimes. There's just this eeriness that settles over. It's that unsettling silence and recognizing that in nature, anybody who spent some time outside in a little bit of the country somewhere during the summer, there's just life right around you. So to just hear nothing, so unsettled. I mean, that I can't imagine.
But it must be a similar experience to seeing a ghost. I mean, it just it's hard to you probably look at it and say, is this possible? Maybe I'm not seeing this right. But then you realize you are seeing it right, that it's really there. And at that moment of recognition, I think, like I said, I think there's just a shiver that goes through your bones, and that's where they were then. So now the whole nighttime sky is filled with these orbs, and they start dropping to the ground, almost like floating to the ground, as if like parachuting to the ground. And now Steve is panicked.
Yeah, no kidding. I mean, at this point, you'd almost so see if he's still rationalizing his head, right? Because I'm sure if I'm seeing this, I'm still going to be going through every other.
Yep.
Even though I'm into this field, I'm gonna be trying to rationalize this in some sort of sense. Like he was thinking military in the area. I believe there was an airport or something that wasn't too far away.
Yes.
So maybe in his mind, sure, it's 89. It was the tail end of it, but we were still dealing with a little bit of the whole idea of the Cold War, very tail end of it. Exactly. Maybe in his mind, he's thinking, the Russians are.
That's the first thing he did think.
Did he really think?
No,
okay.
That's absolutely what he thought. Because when they start dropping to the ground, they start rushing towards him. So the first thing he does, and this is instinctive, he goes to the camper and gets his guns. So he's got a vest, a
he's
bullet.
Ready to go.
He's ready to do battle with these things, and his wife starts getting mental. Telepathic messages, and the message basically is, don't try to hurt us or we'll kill you. Get in the camper.
A very strong, clear message.
Get in the camper and sit there quietly. And so he's very aggressive, and she says, no, don't do that, put the gun away, and he starts to get the same messages. By the way, what they see coming towards them now are pairs of red eyes. Red eyes. So hundreds of red eyes rushing towards them. And they go into the back of the camper, and that's when things get really interesting.
So I have gone back and forth on this in my head before, because we've heard the red eye thing over the years many times mentioned, right? Whether it be, perhaps a Bigfoot encounter. But one person that shed a little more light on that to me, that really made me think of it just a little bit different. I don't know if you ever heard of the name before or not, but Chris Bledsoe. I don't know if you know this name or not.
Vaguely, I've heard the name.
Okay, so he talked about this in passing one time, and his son Ryan, who's been obviously has a podcast, who's been talking about a lot more. Bledsoe said so, and he mentioned this, and I've wondered if this is applicable to the situation, which is that when we see those red-eyed beings in these different cases where people have some sort of an experience with off-world, beings of some sort or an extraterrestrial, he said that it is their young ones, like their children, and that they're in a safety suit, like an encasement, like how we would bubble wrap our children, right? Like how we put helmets on them, trying to keep them
Yes.
safe. Essentially the same thing, and that they're not quite developed enough yet to control all of their abilities. So they're a little bit more. They have a little more. I don't want to say this wrong. I don't want to speak for him, but they may not be as contained as some of the older ones. Essentially, they're children, is what he was saying. And I think that that's kind of interesting based on some of the events that we're leading up to in a second. But we're talking, you're saying hundreds?
Hundreds, yeah.
What do you do? I mean, all I can picture in my mind, if somebody can picture this a little bit, if you're getting into this trailer, you start receiving these telepathic messages, and you're seeing hundreds of little red eyes running. All I can try to put my mind in is like, the zombie movies where they just have all the zombies just swarming wherever they're at.
Yeah.
That's all I can kind of see in my mind. And I'm sure that the whole time that any of this would be happening, you'd just be sitting there going, this can't be happening.
Yeah,
There's no way that we're experiencing this right now.
Exactly. So they get into the camper, and they sit there sort of Indian style, and two monitors, like electric forces. Like if you looked at a fire plug, there are two of them at the lip of the camper, and they're sort of electrified. And so when Steve tries to move forward, they move forward. If he moves a foot forward, they move forward a foot. If he moves close, he gets electrocuted. He gets a jolt of electricity.
See,
So they're trapped. So now they're trapped. And in the meantime, these red-eyed creatures become more in focus. And what they are, or what they appear to be, they describe them as gremlins. So small creatures, like leather kind of faces, red eyes, piercing red eyes, clearly malevolent,
okay.
frenetic, incredible energy.
Okay, so this...
Really, that frenetic, incredible energy, but malevolent.
Okay.
These are not beings that want to do anything good for them, and they're literally on the camper. They close the blinds on the camper, and these things are on the hood. They're in the trees, and that's when they see a UFO that's the size of a battleship that literally caps the valley above them, and the blinds become absolutely useless because the light is so intense, and so they look up, and this giant UFO. They talked about the size of a football field, which is very interesting because when Fife Symington, the former governor of Arizona, discussed the Phoenix Lights and the craft that he saw slowly hovering by him and 100 other people, he described it as the size of a football field. So that caught my attention too, that these similar descriptions. But it capped the valley, literally capped it, and they had it was a classic sort of UFO shape, but there were smaller units, smaller UFOs, disc-shaped objects that were hung from it. And around that time, the second set of beings, they call them the Illuminated figures, surround the camper, and there are 9 of them. And these blinds mean nothing. These blinds mean nothing because the light is so intense. And these Illuminated figures, they describe, if the ones are frenetic and sort of gremlin-like, these would be like scientists. They're there literally surrounding the camper, studying them with incredible intensity.
So to be clear on this, because I know you just said it, but so we have the little ones never, let's say, entered the trailer. They just are on the outside causing the ruckus. They're just everywhere.
The monitors are locking them in.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then these ones that are now monitoring them, or scientists, as it were, they do not enter either, though, right?
No, they're outside the camper.
Okay. And then
outside the camper.
what was keeping him at the door? Because like you said, when he tried to take a step forward, was there anything in?
Yes, monitors, two monitors, sort of like
That's
fire
right.
plugs, sort of
Yes,
like
I
fire
forgot
plugs.
about that. Okay.
And
So
so
nothing else is in there. Just these things that are now watching them from the outside that have this clear
he's got
intent.
a gun over,
On
shotgun
his lap.
on his lap, another Remington rifle on his lap, but obviously he can't do anything. And so literally they're trapped and contained. And this is what makes this story so incredibly bizarre and real at the same time. About that time, prior to what becomes almost a kind of torture, uh, if you want to use that word, because what a scientist would do to a chimpanzee,
Hmm.
or what a scientist would do to a rabbit or a lab rat,
Yeah.
that's the way they were viewed by these illuminated figures, as an experiment, totally unemotional. But in the meantime, they feel this rumbling, this tremendous rumbling, like the earth is shaking underneath them. And they hear this rumbling sound and smell the unmistakable, I won't say scent because it's too, let's call it stench of
Okay. There we go
or
with the
burning
sulfur.
rubber. And from the craft emerges a sort of triangular object that combs the desert floor. And it seems like a kind of mining operation is going on, where this triangular object instrument is combing the ground, and they're mining underneath. So it's pinpointing certain areas. Now, interestingly enough, the Mojave Desert is famous for rare earths.
Okay.
A lot of uh, uh, elements
Yeah,
that
rare earth elements. Yeah.
rare earth elements that are used in laser weaponry, etc. And so they think a kind of mining operation is going on at the same time. Now, simultaneous to this, they're surrounded, and now there's this incredible telepathic domination
Hmm.
that starts to happen. They're taken back, but not like a dream, but literally like taken back to experience different things in their life. Some happy things, let's say a marriage,
Okay.
some moments of exaltation. Let's say you're a football player and you
Winning the
score
big
a
game,
touchdown, you
right?
win
Making
the
the
big
big
game.
play.
Um, let's say the birth of a child, but they weren't all positive. Some of them were terrifying. So, for example, Dawn had when she was a young girl, had a sexual assault. And so she was forced to relive that to the moment.
So rough.
Steve, who was an avid hunter, as we know, was forced to have the tables turned, where he was being hunted by a group of men, like the animals were, and
Wow.
actually shot and skinned. So I mean, so the idea was that one would actually be screaming in terror, while the other was going through another kind of experience, simultaneous, side by side.
Well, that's what I was
And,
going to ask you is like, while this is happening, it wasn't at the same time. What? So you're
yes,
getting to, not only are you going to this traumatic thing or this exhilarating thing, you're watching your person you care about the most too go through this right next to
exactly,
you.
exactly.
My
So,
goodness.
so
So,
they thought first of all, they thought they were going to have a heart attack. So their bodies are pumping, their hearts are pumping, their pulse rate is beyond um, you know beyond healthy levels. Let's at least say that.
yeah, mine would be too.
But then what would happen is a sort of mist, a cool mist would come into the camper, and it would be like a sedative. It would
Hmm.
calm them down so that they wouldn't have a heart attack. And so it would be sort of like this. And this is what makes it insidious and terrifying. It was like they were being kept alive. In other words, we're not going to let you die.
Right.
We're not going to let you have a heart
Can't
attack
let you pass away here,
because we still have more experiments to do.
man.
And so the whole thing, like I said, is a chilling experience on many levels. Now you can see it's a multi-dimensional situation in terms of levels of emotion, and they think they've gone crazy. So literally, they start pinching one another. So Dawn would pinch Steve and say, "This is what I see. What do you see?" And they'd compare notes to make sure that they were seeing the same things at the same time in minute detail, which
Yeah.
struck me as such a credible thing to do.
I mean, but this sounds like this went on for
Hours,
hours, right? We're talking that basically it sounds like a
hours,
majority of the evening into
yeah,
the early morning
hours,
times.
hours, and so they were sort of kept alive on this basis. They thought they were in hell. They thought they had died and were in hell. I mean, isn't that a stunning statement? But that's what she
That
says
is.
actually. Uh, in the book, there's a lot of dialogue, a lot of quotes that come from recordings and from the videotaped hypnotic sessions and whatnot. But this was all conscious, so they didn't need to be retrogressed for this. This was happening. They could, just like you and I are talking. You know,
Confirm.
this was this was a real situation, not buried in any way, and so they're going through this sort of torment, and even to the point where they sort of tease them. They withdraw, and they're saying, "Thank God, maybe it's over," but then they come back even stronger. And so this is playing with their minds in ways. And by the way, the things about their kids that I really don't want to get into, but you can imagine
Yeah.
the whole idea. Dawn said later in analyzing it with Dr. Annixter was that she didn't feel like they understood human emotions, and this was a way to study how humans react, what fear is like, what makes somebody afraid, what horror is like, what ecstasy is like, what happiness is like, what gratification is like, what terror is like. So it's this sort of roller coaster where, I mean, you, me, or anyone, I suppose, would just say, "I think we've gone crazy."
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's funny, like I've seen in the chat, some of the people are talking about saying that as far as the smell, it's been associated, I guess in the past, people were saying with the sulfur, with demons and stuff. And some
Yeah.
people say they've seen one. So I could see why they would think at this time that they're literally living in hell at that moment. They're experiencing a hell-like moment at least.
Yeah.
Mr. Gary Voorhees, thank you very much for that super chat, brother, and good to see you in the chat tonight.
So this is the really interesting thing. I mean, it's almost like they're having a kind of extraterrestrial or almost religious experience, in the sense that there seems to be a sort of good and evil thing going on here, and what really caps it in that sense is this: just when they believe that they're either dead or going to die for sure, and that their kids are in grave danger,
Hmm.
um, this presence, an angelic presence, appears in the sky,
Okay.
and unmistakably feminine, uh, in the shape of a kind of angelic presence. They called this their comforter, and basically this female voice telepathically tells them, "You'll survive this. Your kids will be okay. This will be over soon. Don't panic. Don't just hold it together. This
Yeah.
this won't last forever." And of course, they were incredibly grateful about that. And after that, they get very tired. Things
Classic, right?
things start to withdraw. They get incredibly tired, like drugged, and they go to sleep. They wake up hours later, sprawled on the outside the camper, sprawled on the ground with the fire dead, and fully clothed, but terribly disoriented, of course. And they think the end of the world happened. They
Yeah.
can't imagine that this was something that just happened to them because it was on such a massive scale. So they think, you mentioned the Russians, they thought that there was some sort of attack, that this was part of a global attack and a world
Right.
war. And so they pack up to go home. And again, this whole idea of we've just experienced something that is so large, so huge, that it's hard to you get your feet on the ground again. But they want to find out who else has heard about it. So they turn the radio on and they're expecting, some news bulletins.
Yeah.
No news bulletins, which to them is,
You go.
unbelievable. But so they hear a country western song or Randy Travis or whoever singing.
Good
Then
old Randy Travis.
so
That's a
then
good.
not too far. They drive in their camper, and several miles away they run into an older couple who were camping.
Okay.
Did you see anything peculiar? They were very skittish about
Not putting it
things.
right out there.
Yeah. So they say no. We went to bed early, and we didn't see anything. So again, this is part of the post-traumatic stress syndrome thing, where you've had this experience that is absolutely life-altering, and then you run into somebody that's 5 miles away. They say, "Well, we didn't hear a thing. We turned the radio on. We didn't hear a thing." So that's so jarring because you have this energy built up inside you that this incredible thing happened, but no one knows about it. And how do you tell someone about it? So they drive home. They feel like they're being followed. They have this.
Interesting feeling to have that, right? That
Yeah,
sense of being watched. Even if nothing's there, you just have that sense.
exactly. And they think they're being followed. But again, this could be part of the same syndrome where once you experience something like that, you're so paranoid, you're so into it that of course you're going to feel like you're followed, whether you are or you aren't. But they had that terrible sensation. And really, they reluctantly tell their parents because their parents notice something is horribly wrong. And their parents said, "Well, I'm sure that you think you saw something, that kind of thing. I'm sure you believe this happened." But that's the most patronizing and awful thing in the world, right? In other words, it didn't really happen, but I believe that you think it happened. And so they were terribly disturbed and disappointed that that's kind of the way it came down. The parents knew something was really wrong with them, but they thought there was some misunderstanding, that it was a desert warfare exercise or whatever. But they didn't think that what they said happened, and that was really why they just shut up.
Agreed.
And they said, if our own parents can't believe this,
Yeah,
who
that's
am
what
I?
Apollo 11's in the chat is saying. It totally,
Really?
that has to be so hard because you're open, like you said, you'd hope, right, the closest ones of your family that you could to maybe share or say something, and it's just kind of passed off as, well, I'm sure that's, good for you, that's true belief, kind of deal. And by the way, Larry, congratulations on 2 months of being a Dr. Scientist member. Thank you very much for supporting the show. Thank you. Yeah, so I'm sure as this experience is coming to, like, I'm picturing in my mind, as we've already referenced earlier, maybe a soldier coming home from war,
Yes.
or you go to the hospital, maybe you work in the medical field or anything like that, where you've had this just absolutely traumatic experience, just not even a couple hours ago, and you go out and people are talking about they're upset because they had to stand in the line a little bit longer or something.
Yeah.
It's
Exactly.
like the issues of the world just don't matter anymore
Exactly.
in comparison. Right. And
So,
I'm just trying to imagine how they got back to everyday life,
Well, actually, they didn't. They didn't get back to everyday life. And as a matter of fact, they did have experiences in their own home.
Really?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. There's a couple. I mean, I have to say, I'm not blatantly trying to promote my book, but if
we should get the book. I'm going to drop the link again, guys. You should definitely get the book.
If you read the scene, it's amazing. Because, for example, they're asleep and they wake up and all of a sudden both of them want to make love.
Really?
Yeah. So they do. but they're surrounded by these beings watching them making love around the bed.
In their own, this is in their own
Yes,
home.
in their own home. In
And did they stop to convert to ask each other like, "Are you seeing this?" Or like,
I think it was like it's sort of like robotic.
okay,
Yeah, like
I
robotic.
see what you're saying a little more. So
Yeah.
it was just we're moving where we're being told to move at this point kind of
Yes,
deal. Kind of like when they
exactly.
went into the trailer, even though
Yeah,
he had a gun in his hand.
exactly like that. And another incident, which is pretty terrifying. Steve Jr., who was, I want to say, four, three or
Okay.
four, I guess, at the time. This is a different night. 3 in the morning or so, lets out this awful scream. He says, screaming hysterically. They both rush into the room, and he's in the center of the room, spinning like a top.
He's in the air spinning like a top.
Yes.
How?
So Dawn rushes to grab him, holds him,
Yeah.
embraces him, and he goes, don't ever leave. I'm scared. Don't leave. Don't leave the room.
Poor
So
little guy.
she goes, why? What happened? She goes, there are monsters. So she goes, oh, there are no monsters. He goes, no, there are monsters. They're little and they have red eyes.
What do you do as a parent? You know, like I said, there's been parts when I've listened to this story, I've read, you know, parts in the book as well, where it truly breaks my heart. Like I said, that experience of them being in the trailer, and if you're just coming in, maybe you get a chance to go back and listen, you hear what the experience that they experienced there, and then what we're going through right here, which is in their own home. Now you'd hope in the sanctity of your home, right? Right?
Exactly.
Maybe that happened there, but that was that place. But now I'm in my home,
Yeah.
and this is happening. And now no longer just me. Now I have my I have a almost 4-year-old upstairs right now myself. I couldn't imagine the fear, you know, that they have when they have a bad dream, let
Absolutely.
alone this. What do you
Yeah.
do with that?
Absolutely. And another situation at home, so I just, and which explains like what I got to when I got there and met them, what they'd been through. Um, Again, Steve is half asleep. They're in bed, and he sees a being walk through the wall. It's about 4 feet high, large eyes, very standard to that. No mouth to speak of, a slit, big eyes, uh, enlarged head,
Okay.
wearing a kind of suit, a white suit. And the white suit has an arrow in the center, the chest, that's sort of a truncated arrow. So if you looked at an arrow and took the head of the arrow and
Okay.
the first couple of inches, it's a red thing on that's on his like a kind of
Okay.
uniform.
So
And
just a solid blocked arrow
yeah,
with a little red dot basically
yeah,
at the tip of the
and
arrow there.
and it starts stroking Dawn's face with its long elongated fingers. So Steve is seeing this in horror, but paralyzed as he's watching. And uh, Dawn then gets up screaming. She runs to the mirror, and her face is covered with burns. And so he gets a camera, wants to take pictures of it, and he does. The pictures don't come out; they're just blank. And she's hysterical because she thinks she's been disfigured.
Hmm.
But the marks go away in the course of a few hours. But again, this is in your home. This is the sanctity of your home, and
Yeah.
so I guess I talk about post traumatic stress syndrome or whatever, but obviously this is much worse than that because it doesn't stop. And
And when this is going on too, if you don't mind my asking,
mhm,
so are they? They still don't have anybody to even talk besides each other, right? They're experiencing these
right,
things. They don't have
no,
a physician or a licensed
and
person to.
that's where Paul Moran, the mutual
Okay.
friend,
Okay.
comes in, and this is about the time that I saw them, and they kept having nightmares, horrible nightmares about an abduction, about being dragged onto the UFO, and they just bits and pieces that were terrifying. And so when I met them and got to know them, I said, you know, and you know, my background was sort of law enforcement. So I'd worked with a lot of detectives, True Detective Magazine, and you know, detectives working on the stories and whatnot. So I said, we're going to handle this like an investigation. So I'm going to get the best doctor that I know
Right.
that I can find. So I had a roommate that was Georgetown, who was a surgeon, became a surgeon. So I called him, I hadn't talked to him in years, so it was a pretty strange conversation.
Call him up out of the blue. Hey, buddy, how's it going?
I have this situation. So anyway, he said, "I'll tell you." He thought, he thought it was kind of funny that after all these years, I'm calling him about a UFO experience, and. But anyway, I said, I want the best psychiatrist that you know of, the most credible one, and I'll pay them whatever they need. Hear this story, they'll want to be involved. So I told him the story, and he said, I could see why somebody would, a guy like Bernie Vitone, Dr. Vitone, who is the director of the National Center of Psychiatry in Washington, D.C., agreed to study them, to put them through a battery of tests and interviews and determine, again, whether they were prone to fantasy, whether they were neurotic, whether they were psychotic, whether they were liars, whether they were concerned about money, making money in some sensational way. And what he found was what I found, was that there was no hint of neuroses. They were the least. He's a construction guy. I mean, like an architect kind of guy, the least kind of fellow that's prone to fantasy. And they were religious to a point, not to a fanatical point. They went to church. They raised kids in the church. So they were really salt of the earth, backbone of the country kind of people. That's what he came up with. No psychosis, no neurosis, no penchant for fantasy, nothing like that.
Yeah.
So then the next step, and this was Dr. Batone, who you become sort of friends in the course of these things. I said, look, I need the best retrogressive hypnotist that you can think of or that you could find, because it's got to be credible. I don't just want somebody. I want somebody that's really reputable. Because I went to medical school with a guy that works with the FBI. And then what he does is work with terrorists and assault victims, rape victims and whatnot, who are so traumatized they don't remember details of the crime or details of the situation. So let's just say I'm in an airport. There's a terror attack, and all I remember is an explosion, because the rest is, that overshadows everything.
Yeah.
But through retrogressive hypnosis, they actually bring that person back to that day and that moment and those moments. And they can say, oh, there was a guy with a bag. He put the bag down. How tall was he? What did he look like? And they get detail. So that's what he was doing with the FBI. And so fortunately, we're very lucky, he agreed to spend 4 days with them. And so we flew to North Carolina.
So he was pretty apprehensive at first, right? Like he wasn't on board.
Absolutely. But the good news is that I knew this one fellow who was a reputable surgeon, who knew the director of psychiatry, who was a well-known guy, who knew another guy. So basically, it's one credible guy. I know you, you're a friend. Maybe you want to help me out with this. So even though the story itself was sort of fantastic, but you'd be amazed how many people have had UFO experiences that don't talk about it.
Very true. If you just ask them, right? If you just ask them.
And by the way, among these people, they'd never said that, but clearly they were very, very interested in this topic.
Mm-hmm.
And it calls to mind one time I was doing an interview with some sort of disc jockeys in Los Angeles. And so, this is all this kind of banter that goes on, early morning jokes and this, that, and the other, back and forth. And so I did this interview, which was really a terrible place to get interviewed. So, so they're making jokes, sort of. And finally, I said, I'll bet one of you has had an experience like this. And there was a silence. The jaw dropped, and one guy said, I did. The whole tenor of the interview. Now, here's a guy making fun of the situation, making fun of me. But then once you confront them and say, I'll bet you had something similar to this. And son of a gun, he did. The one didn't, but the other did. And I think there's many, many people that have had situations like this. Jimmy Carter, the president, former president, had a
Very
UFO.
true.
Ronald Reagan had 2 UFO
Yes, he
experiences. Mike
did.
Remington, Air Force pilots, commercial air pilots, and it's not something people are prone to talk about unless it's brought out of them. But
Matter of fact, he had didn't he? He had it. I apologize to interject it, but
yeah,
he
not
had
at
his
all.
experience with his wife too, right? His second experience, wasn't it, with Ronald Reagan? I believe.
Yes,
Is that right?
I do.
Yeah.
This was in Lucille Ball had an autobiography, and Reagan was mentioned in it. And apparently, there was an actor, William Holden, who was
Okay.
having a party, and so the Reagans were invited. Lucille Ball was there, and I guess several others. I can't think of offhand who else, but celebrities.
Yeah.
So the Reagans showed up like an hour and a half late, which is very unusual. So Reagan was one of those guys that if he said I'll
Very
be there at 8
punctual.
o'clock, he was there at 8 o'clock. So everybody's sort of surprised, like what happened. And they talked about following a UFO that they saw. They actually followed it towards Fresno, I guess, and it took out off like a bat out of hell. Just you've seen these videos where you've seen these things take off a tremendous acceleration.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing, and Lucille Ball didn't say this other than to say that the Reagans talked about it, and that's why they were late. But they were amazed that they were an hour and a half late. They
Oh, so
thought
they didn't even. So it was
they
confusing
thought
even to
it was a
them too.
15-minute excursion. And so you could make a case that Ronald Reagan had an alien abduction experience with missing time. How about
Love
that?
that. I really do. There's so much with the presidents, and I mean Dwight Eisenhower and some other.
Yes.
There's a lot we could go with there, but another time. I'll say the
Yes.
first.
So, make a long story short, in terms of the retrogressive hypnosis, it was nothing short of stunning. So they had been taking aboard the craft. They were examined. The blood samples were taken. They were anally examined, and etc.
My.
Both, both.
Did they remember anything besides the physical examination? Did they remember being like any tests put in front of them, anything like that, where they were doing anything, just anything besides the
Yeah, they
physical?
remembered an instrument, and Dawn talked about an instrument pinching her with 2 probes, and had marks. As a matter of fact, during the hypnosis session, she kept pawing at her neck, and so Annixter, the doctor, said, "Why are you doing that?" And she says, "Probes," just like that, probes, and
Huh.
and they talked about, why were you involved in this? What do these beings want? And one of the things that came up, which I thought was fascinating, was when will there be a contact, communion between an alien civilization and Earth? And the doctor said, "Let it be in my lifetime." And under hypnosis, Dawn says, "How long will you live?" And he says, "Would it be in my kid's lifetime?" And she says, "It will be in your children's lifetime." And actually, she started almost talking in a robotic voice as if it was channeled. And then she said, "I know where the universe ends. The universe ends."
That's such a thing to like transit. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
To go
yeah.
from that to
I
just
know where the universe ends. I jotted it down.
because
The
I
universe
imagine.
ends
Oh, go
when the
ahead. Sorry.
things that matter, stop mattering to us and start mattering to them.
I mean, okay. So I have found this unique, because there's so many that try to talk about like they know where the end of the universe. We getting close to seeing the edge of the universe so that it's ever expanding.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I have mixed feelings, and when you hear stuff like this, it makes you wonder if they're saying, well, their universe begins where ours ends. That would imply that we're not ever expanding, perhaps. And maybe there really is an end, because they always tell us, right, we can never see the end of it. By the time we see the end of it, it's the end of time, because then the light we'll never catch the end of it.
I think if you examine it, it's a very complex sort of statement,
Yeah.
but you rattled it off like staccato, like robotic. The universe ends when the things that matter stop mattering. So you see matter like physical matter, and then mattering like this matters to me. So it's a very nice much a play on words. When the things that matter stop mattering to us and start mattering to them. So in other words, when the important things about life and the planet, etc., stop mattering to us, we don't care about it, that's when they'll start caring about it. Which, yeah.
And I wondered, do you take that in two ways? Do you say that, do they mean very literal, as in like when we're ready to destroy, maybe this planet, then that's when they're going to care. When we stop caring about it, that's when it'll
Yes.
matter. Or is it until that moment that there will be no intervening? Perhaps it's, I don't really know. I know she said a bit more too on this as far as, because I believe you got to ask some questions and you were given out because you were there when this was taking place,
That's
which
right.
had to have been, again, if you weren't there, do you think, be honest, do you think if you were reading this, or if you're just somebody that you knew at the bar that you generally knew just told you this, do you think you'd believe it?
I'll tell you where I would be. I would be like in the beginning when you're talking about different kinds of beings and spaceship. I would be very skeptical until I went to the hypnotic sessions. Because the hypnotic sessions are incredibly specific. She talks about 5 galaxies. She talks about the one as a kind of leader or a kind of god. And so actually, Annixter says, so the one, is this a kind of leader? And really strongly, she says, it's a kind of god like that.
It's a kind of god. I wonder too if, maybe if she was, channeling or whatever might have been going on.
That was the definite impression I got.
Yeah, it just makes you wonder if that, okay, I've heard this talked about before. Obviously, I know that the SR crew, and Dave Scott and those are over there, and Lynn does a great show too, and she's talked about this a couple times with Samantha Mowat, and if you've never looked her up, you should look into her a little bit, but she talked about the idea that why a lot of these encounters almost deal with something telepathic is because we lack the vocabulary to express everything that's going on. So sometimes when these words come through that we're kind of like looking at, we're like, it's just like the best way that they can express it to us, and we're just missing it. It's our vocabulary, it's too limited.
Sure.
It could be very literal what she said, with the whole idea. I don't think that it's like a God statement is. I think that's as literal as you can get.
Yeah.
But going back to that whole, their universe ends, I believe she hit on the idea of like the 5 galaxies, right?
He's trying to unite the 5 galaxies,
which seems like a direct statement. That isn't. I don't know. Is it hinting at dimensional stuff? I don't know.
I don't think it's metaphorical. I think it's real.
Well, why don't I let you explain that part? For those who might be listening, this might be their first time hearing. So she says it's like a god, and then I don't remember if it was prior to that or just after, where she gets hinting at this idea of, we said, well, where do the galaxies end? And they said that's where theirs began. And then we how did we end up with this idea, even coming to the conclusion of hearing this idea that there might be 5 galaxies?
She was told that.
Okay, so this is when she was on the craft or something downloaded for her?
This actually, you said channeling, and that's what it was to me. All of a sudden, a sort of gentle, whispery voice becomes a very direct, robotic kind of voice. And, it put all of us on the edge of our seat because she sits forward, she sits straight up. It's a different demeanor entirely. And so, the strong impression we got is that somebody else was speaking through her.
Yeah. I wonder too, has any of some of their experience, I guess, haunted you even in your own, just a little bit in the back of your head with some of what she has shared? And in particular, that one session, I guess, because a lot came out there. Is this the same session where the gentleman, he basically... Was this where he just wanted to go home? He kind of broke down, or was this prior to that?
No. There were 2 days. They did separately 2 different. So one was in one room, one was in another room, and that happened for 2 days. So there were probably about 10 hours with each.
So they purposely. And here's the thing. We always talk about, well, could we? Do we know? How well is the story? It sounds like the way you guys went about this. I don't know how much more professionally you guys could have gone about it, as far as really vetting the story to the best of the abilities that we could.
We had a polygraph test. We had him take a polygraph test. But, interestingly enough, Dawn was pregnant shortly after the experience. became pregnant.
Really?
And they were very concerned, about the child and whatnot. But yeah, yeah. So they were separate. It was done on, intentionally that way to compare the stories to see if, in a pinch, this is what detectives do. You tell your side of it, I tell my side of
Yep.
it, and
Yep.
supposedly, if we're both telling the truth and we saw the same thing, there'll be variations, but the basic story and certain details will be the same. And these stories, matched. They were just from two different points of view. But yeah, that's true. At one point, they were both like screaming, crying. This was real trauma, and yeah, I mean, basically, Steve just said, this is under hypnosis. I want to go home. I just want to go home. But he was talking about being on the craft.
Right. When he
Yeah,
was okay. Poor guy.
yeah.
Yeah. I just, I don't think that. Again, we were talking about this in the chat here a little bit tonight. Apollo's mentioned it here, Apollo 11 and some other ones, saying that sometimes in the community, and it's not necessarily, I don't think, intentional. I get we don't want to dwell on say negative things or people perceive it as a negative thing, and I'm not necessarily saying that this experience that they certainly seem to have made the best of it going forward, but it was my interpretation of it a bit of a negative experience. It was not exactly a positive thing, at least initially. Now,
Except for the this is the thing. I'm not a particularly religious fellow, so
yeah,
so just understand that. But there are definitely religious overtones to this. Now, this is the thing. Religion and science are just a matter of interpretation.
very
Just a matter of
true.
interpretation.
Even how
So,
we look at the story while we're listening to it.
so a religious person sees something that a scientist sees. They'll explain it in a totally different way. They saw exactly the same thing, but it's a different prism that they're putting the experience through, different
Right.
lens. And so I wonder sometimes if science is correct, ufologists are correct, and religious people are correct, that these things happen. They're just interpreted in a different way. So, for example, you call it the one or a supreme leader or whatever, I call it God.
Yeah.
These are just semantics. At the end of the day, what happened was that there was this angelic presence, the comforter that really calmed things, that seemed to control things, that hovered above. So if the gremlins were on some weird demonic level, the scientists were on illuminated figures on a sort of scientific logical level, and then above that is this kind of comforter who puts things to rest. So from their standpoint, they turned to religion afterwards.
Okay.
And found sukkah comfort in that, and the interpretation that came out was that they had a kind of demonic possession situation where there was a godlike or angelic situation, the gremlins, etc., and that there were two poles: one that was violent and ugly, and the other that was beatific.
Yeah, because you said quite literally their faces had almost a leathery kind of look, the ones with the red eyes, correct?
Yeah, the way you might describe a demon in medieval times.
Yeah.
So I mean, I don't know what to make of it beyond telling you the story. But I think that for 8 hours, 10 hours, a curtain was pulled and a whole new level of existence was exposed, and the Hesses saw it and lived it.
I would love to ask you this too. With this, so after this, the going back to the initial regression here, when that finished up, and they obviously, I might ask, okay, too, if it's okay to ask. Well, I guess I'm just gonna ask is, they knew you were writing a book, right? I mean, did
Yes.
they know? Okay, now leading up to its release, what was the process like that for them? Did they have a lot of anxiety about this? I mean, this is going to be becoming more public, and how did they handle that exactly?
Well, they didn't. I mean, we had a pseudonyms to
Okay.
preserve their anonymity,
Yeah.
and so that was one thing that I guaranteed them, and I lived up to that. They came forward finally of their own volition, much later. I let them read everything that I wrote almost page by page
Right.
so that it was accurate. And I think at the end, I think a couple of things came out of this. I think that for them it was cathartic. I think that it was a release of this horrible secret that they held inside, that they were finally able to communicate. So I think in that sense, it was very positive. It was certainly very positive. From another standpoint, as I said, they gravitated towards the Mormon Church.
Hmm.
They told this story to the bishop, etc., who had obviously a different interpretation than
Like you were talking about, right?
somebody else might have. But uh, they what they found was that this reinforced their religious beliefs in sort of good and evil, and the fact that there's a spiritual world, the fact that there's a universe out there that is unlike the one that we live in, the fact that our perspective, our purview on reality is very, very limited. And so uh, I would say in the end, would they say, gee, I want my kids to go through this too, or I want my best friend to go through this? I don't think so.
Hmm.
But in the end, I think what they found was a kind of, I don't want to say salvation, but a kind of uh, gratification, a kind of satisfaction, something like that.
I'm
That
sure
the
some
story,
validation too, to
validation,
come out of this. I mean,
better word.
with the amount of, I mean, even family kind of denying you, and well, I'm sure
Yes.
that's what you thought you experienced, and to have these things such, I mean, deeply personal things in your home
Yeah.
happening to you. I can't imagine the anxiety, the fear, the unknown. Again, I know there's been some question and people hypothesizing around the birth time of that child. You
Yes.
know, is that something that they ever addressed with you or brought up concerns with you? Even did they at
Not,
least
not,
hint at
not,
it?
not too much. I think there was just a couple of things that um, I think we all stayed away from.
Hmm.
I think it gets too personal at some point in time. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I just didn't know
So,
if they had ever mentioned anything that way because I know
well,
I've
they were
heard
very
some.
concerned. They were very concerned about the child, the birth of the child.
Yeah,
There was an incident in the camper, which I didn't mention, and the story is more intricate than obviously I'm able to tell you in an
yeah,
interview like this. But one of the illuminated figures tossed from its fingertip something through the glass and into her stomach, into her abdomen, a kind of if you talked about the lit part of a cigarette,
yeah. Like the ember, as it
yeah,
were.
and which went into her abdomen, and between that and the experience they had um, in their bed in their home, where they felt like they were surrounded by these
Being
beings,
watched.
I'm sure that a fear that they had was that in some way these experiences would affect the child. So there was some consternation over that, some anxiety over that. Let's say.
Do you think too? I mean, obviously, we got a question here in just a second from Apollo 11 who asks, by the way, did the couple have any ideas on why it happened to them? Were they in a unique place in life at the time? What attributes attracted the experience? So, do you have any feelings and/or thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think that Steve had this experience like when he was a kid, 9 years old or so. Remember, I
Mm-hmm.
mentioned that. So I mean, that's not uncommon either in these stories where basically people are followed. And if you think again, getting back to the idea of scientists, I mean, we tag animals, right? We tag them
Certainly do.
and we follow their life. We follow how they eat. We follow how they breed. We follow, how they develop. And I mean, if I had to take a stab at it, I think that Steve was somehow tagged. I think that's one angle. The other is it was just a giant coincidence that they were
Yeah,
there. They were there on
purely.
a mining expedition.
Yeah.
Maybe refueling their craft, maybe literal mining exhibition, and
Hmm.
this happened to be the coincidence that happened. And from the aliens' standpoint, let's make the most of it.
Right.
So, but I would more lean towards the following the life of an individual.
Now, did she have any experiences when she was younger? I forgot to ask you about that when you mentioned it with him
Not that I'm
having.
aware. Not that I'm aware of. Not that she ever told
Okay.
me about.
So
And I
her.
did ask, but I guess the answer is no.
Okay, so her first encounter was
Yeah.
essentially with what took place there
Right.
in the desert.
Interestingly enough, as soon as they emerged from hypnosis and realized where they were, Dawn looked at Dr. Annixter and said, "Are we crazy?"
So
Again,
even in that moment, even with all that confirmation, again, well, let me actually, I'll be careful how I word this. I don't feel there's a right or wrong way to really share your experience because when it's happened, it's happened. So I'm not real big on, well, this is exactly how you need to tell it and keep it together and be professional, all that. But I think that any experiencer of anything in life, whether it be a traumatic accident, anything, when you really experience something that shifts your paradigm, especially something like this, I don't know that your brain even allows you to fully allow the whole conceptual idea that it did take place. You're always constantly questioning, did this really, really happen?
right.
And I just think that preaches volumes to this particular case in the solidifying it in my mind as a real encounter because it's something that they still to this, at least in that moment in time, we're still questioning.
Right.
Are we crazy? I have to be crazy, right? That was more plausible to them than going through this.
Yeah. Yeah. I thought, that's what makes this story so real to me, are details like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A question here, by the way, from ufologists. Thank you for being in the chat here tonight. And by the way, guys, anyone else who has any questions, please feel free to fire them away as we have Ron just for a little less than a half hour here or 20 minutes or so, and he'll be getting out of here and we'll be getting over to SOR with Dave Scott. Also, too, I wanted to make it clear, Tammy brought up a good point. Anybody that might be watching, especially when we're talking about a serious subject like this, here in the page of the podcast here, if someone says sus, it is something we started around here. We take a drink of whatever we're drinking that night, so please don't think we're cheering to anything that might be going on that way. It's just something we do here in the chat. So if you see hashtag sus, take a drink of water, whatever favorite beverage you have in your hand. Ufologist has a question that says, has Ron had his own sighting?
I would say no, except it wouldn't be exactly true.
Okay.
It wasn't a sighting, but I can tell you, and this was prior to meeting the Hesses by 15 years.
Okay.
I was living on the Jersey Shore at the time, and I had a dog. And so in my dream, I had a dream, very vivid dream. There was a pond not far from where my house was. The ocean was in one direction. The house was here. And then there was a pond near my house. So I was walking the dog, which I did regularly, of course.
Yeah.
And we stop at the pond. And in the pond, maybe 15 feet below the surface on the bed of the pond, is this object, a glowing object, maybe 30 feet in diameter. And I stopped in the dream, and I thought about it for quite some time, and I decided to jump in the water.
Really?
I did. And when I jumped into the water, I wound up inside this spacecraft, totally dry. And there were these beings that took me around and showed me their equipment and showed me like maps. And I remember it very vividly. I could, probably draw the interior of this thing. And I remember my watch. I had a watch, and the watch stopped. And it was a very pleasant experience, by the way, just contrary to what I've just been telling you.
Yeah, we've been discussing tonight, right?
A very, very pleasant experience. It was a learning experience. It was a deeply satisfying experience. And I felt very privileged. And next thing I knew, I was on the sidewalk again with my dog, and this thing blinked out, and I continued my walk. That was the dream. But I have to tell you, I've never had an experience like that, because I would say for a month after that, I had this incredible euphoria. I just felt like amazingly blessed, amazingly uh, privileged, happy. And so that would be, I don't know if that counts as a UFO experience, but that, and I would bet, and then really if I had to do over again, I would have asked Annixter to retrogress me.
Call him up. I mean, well,
Yeah,
I don't know. He called somebody up, I'm
I
sure.
would have asked him to retrogress me, because I'm convinced that if he did, there was something very, very important and very different about that dream. It was unlike
Yeah.
any other.
You know, Ron, and again, I always emphasize this. I'm such a rookie and Padawan in this whole field in general. So I don't ever express any of my opinions are, but they're simply my observations, opinions. But I had someone say it to me once, and it really stuck with me, which was, most people, and we kind of talked about this in the very beginning of the show, bringing it full circle as we come near the end or getting there. Once again, guys, any questions, please fire away, as Wes H has got one for us coming up, which is that none of us ever really picked this field. It's almost picked us. And
Yeah.
it's funny how people that end up working in this field at all or doing any sort of contribution to it have had an experience of some sort. Even if they don't know about it yet. Like, I
Yeah.
can definitely relate to what you're talking about as far as being a dream.
Yes.
Because that's how, and always people have asked me about you experience it or something. I always say not in the sense that some people have like this. This is, for the Hesses and stuff. It's not a question, right? When you have something that's just dreams, it's a very different thing, because in your head you're still rational. You go, it's a dream, and it's a very, very tricky thing that our minds do to themselves. And so I can relate to you a little bit on that, far as that kind of being back and forth. But yeah, you should definitely look into one day if you're ever comfortable with it.
I'd be comfortable. Actually, it's come to me. Actually, when people have asked me that question, anytime before maybe a year ago, I would say no. But then I was thinking about it, and I said, that's a UFO experience. I mean, this was something, sort of profound. So who knows?
Yeah. We have another question here, by the way, from Wes H. And you guys, like I said, put any questions you have for Ron for the last couple minutes we have for them here. It says, does Ron have any more detail about the, in quotation marks, savior, unquote, or comforter being that seemed to want to help the couple? More of her appearance. Did they see her again?
Yeah, to my knowledge, no, it wasn't. They didn't see her again. But this is the way it was described: that they looked in the sky, and it was like this swirling clouds.
Ooh,
The
I
swirling
like that.
clouds came to form this angelic presence, and unmistakable, and unmistakably feminine, and unmistakably formed. A face, wings, literally an angel as you would
Wow.
imagine, maybe from a biblical picture or painting or something. Voice was very soothing, and that's why they called it a comforter. And it seemed to be, again, there seemed to be sort of grades or levels to these beings. The gremlins being the most like frenetic, um, non-intellectual, very physical, very malevolent. The illuminated figures, clearly unemotional, clearly studying, examining. Then this angelic presence, who seemed gentle
Right.
and in control of the other situations, above them in some way.
I don't know if you've ever heard of this gentleman before or not, but Mr. Terry Lovelace, have you ever heard of him? The
I
Incident
haven't.
at Devil's Den. You should look into that one. You might enjoy having a good conversation with him about it. But he had a situation similar-ish to this with again camping with back in the day military. And anyways, he said that he often thinks back to his encounter when he was on the craft when he had an encounter with a mantis being who was kind of doing this procedure on him. And he said, I often think if I could just have a beer with him, sit on the back porch, he would just lean over, we'd clink our beers, and he'd say, no hard feelings, I was just doing my job.
Yeah.
You know, that was his impression, because Terry was trying to, argue back and fight with him and telepathic, even tell him, you're hurting me. He was very upset. And he basically just touched him on the head and he went out and he went to sleep. But he said it was just this very, the no emotion, kind of involvement there.
That's exactly the way they would describe the illuminated figures. And again, I would look at it like a scientist. It's not necessarily evil, or it's a scientific point of view. So if somebody dissects a frog, I mean, is this an evil person for dissecting a frog? Well, from the frog's point of view, yeah.
Yeah, you're pretty evil in his book, right? There was a question that was brought up. Let me see if I can find it. I believe Adkins asked it earlier in regards to, I don't see, it's not coming up there, but they basically were asking your opinion. Do you think that we're kind of in a, like the whole zoo scenario that's been hypothesized before, that perhaps we're just kind of this species that's being observed, even if we're not being controlled, but at least being observed and guided? I mean, what are your thoughts, I guess? I know it's a little bit broad, but...
Yeah, I'll say two things. One, I think that that there's been a desensitization process that's going on. Started maybe in the 40s, and who knows, maybe way before that. But clearly, things are progressing. Things are moving rapidly.
I would agree with that.
Towards an encounter. If you asked 20 years ago how many people believe the Earth was visited by beings from another universe, probably 10% of the people would say, yeah, I believe that. 90% would say, no, it's nonsense. Today, if you ask that question, it would probably be something like 50-50. It's
right.
A huge paradigm shift in the way people view the world and the possibility. So I think we're moving towards a kind of meeting, a kind of counter on a global level. So I don't know if that answered your question exactly.
Yeah, and basically it said too, they were wondering if we were they were saying perhaps we're some sort of wildlife reserve,
Yeah, no, I don't think it's like that. I think that, and this is something I've just been reading about. I just read a great book called Bewilderment, won the Pulitzer Prize. But basically, it was written by an astrobiologist. And 10 years ago or so, the idea was there's billions of stars, billions of perhaps galaxies and universes on top of universes. But I think more and more as scientists study what it takes to create a human being, a human brain, that we are rather unique creatures, that we're really unique. So I think that that it's very possible, as Francis Crick says, that we're sort of the progeny, the children of another race, an extraterrestrial race. So, for example, Crick said the odds of evolution being true, that from bacteria in a swamp, 10 million years, whatever it is, whatever it is, that we evolved, that human beings with the brain and the complexities of the human brain evolved in that period of time, would be the equivalent of a tornado going through a junkyard and leaving behind a 747 jet that took off and flew to Europe.
Yep.
He thinks it's much more plausible, and I do too, a theory of direct transpermia. And the idea is that maybe a galaxy or a civilization was faltering. Maybe they were dying, their planet was dying, their environment was dying, and they sent out, like shotgun, DNA in the form of asteroids and meteorites that bombarded the universe. And in very, very specific places like Earth, it took root. And so it wasn't from a bacteria or whatever that we evolved, but it was jump-started by the introduction of DNA into Earth, which would make that DNA the DNA of extraterrestrial beings, which would make us the children of extraterrestrial beings. And if you think about it, Willie, if you think about it, That's spontaneous creation, kind of.
It really
Think
is.
about it, it's the Bible in another twisted variation, but the story is almost the same. That from another galaxy we were created, and we weren't created from bacteria. It was purposefully done, direct transpermia. So this is where religion and science and ufology and whatnot really do wind up on a sort of similar plane with just different vocabulary.
I strongly resonate with that. I grew up in a very religious household, and often religion and science were pitted against each other. And I growing up, as I'd read certain parts, like, oh, for instance, right from the start, right when it talks about right in the beginning about every living creature came from the water, right?
Mm-hmm.
Says that right in the Bible. And then you have the idea of what we've been taught, that, okay, yeah, we evolved from the water. And the science even did. I was like, you guys from the get are basically agreeing with each other. Now, I have serious issues with the scale that we're showing of how we maybe ended up where we're at right now. And that's where I think there's, like you're saying, there was some sort of intervention,
Yes.
whatever that change was. It was not clear cut, and it looks so clean, that little chart of evolution of how we got here. And it's like,
Except for the missing link. Except for
oh,
the missing link.
so that's true, right? You never understand how we just made that leap. I often wonder. I mean, from you, obviously, right? And I hang on one second. I might have missed a question here. Hang on, I did miss one. Hey, right here. Oh, maybe they delete. Did they delete it? I think someone was asking. Oh, right here. I apologize, Ghost Dragon. Hang on. Question. It says, it took me 6 go-throughs on his story. Must have been talking about the story, including your books. How long did it take you, Ron, to really go through the story and maybe I'm going to say believing? Part?
And weaving, maybe.
Weaving thing together. Yeah,
Maybe.
weaving thing together. That makes sense.
4 years.
Okay.
Yeah, 4 years.
Yeah. And do you think at that point, when you find that when it was released and was out there, were you, I don't want to use the word, believers, and there's maybe those out there that don't believe it all, but excuse me, were you fully subscribed to the idea that this experience definitely took place for them?
I thought that it definitely took place. I thought it was subject to interpretation. I believe what they said happened. But even mundane things, you watch a baseball game or a football game, whatever you watch the same thing I do, and I tell you, well, this is what it means, or this is what happened. So, I mean, I thought that, yeah, what they say happened. I'm just not sure that it was extraterrestrial. I'm not sure that it had to do with God or demons. I really don't know what label to put on it exactly, because it's such a massive story. But I can tell you this: over time, like many people over the last 20 years, I think whatever doubts I had that there are other existences, that there are, extraterrestrial beings, whether they're time travelers, whether they're us from another age, whatever that it exists.
Yeah.
The question is, what does it mean? So more and more, I don't doubt for a minute at this point, particularly with the Pentagon coming out, and the stories that you hear from airline pilots, from jet pilots, from so many Navy ships, etc. I mean, it's undeniable. The question is, what does it mean? That's the question.
Exactly.
So I've come to doubt in no way, like 100% certainty, that there are other existences, there are other life forms, if you want to call them that, and that Earth is visited either in time warps or in extraterrestrials, or maybe from ourselves or from some spirit world. I don't know, but that this phenomenon is real. The question is exactly, what do you make of it? That's the issue.
And I suppose that with any of this stuff, any of the unknown, as I drop your link once again, guys, in the chat, please feel free to check out all of Ron's books that are listed there on Amazon. What with any of this, I suppose most people, we like to have clear-cut answers, and we tend to, I suppose I'm guilty of this myself. Sometimes instead of going for the clear-cut answer, I can get a little fantastical with things. I like to believe in things not being as clear as black and white as we think they are. But then we have the reverse of that. We have those that are just seeing the world. My brother and I sometimes don't always see eye to eye when it comes to this area because he sees the world as black and white, and there's an answer to everything we don't know yet. And I do believe that there are answers. I just sometimes think that it's funny that we're requesting what could be the answers to work within the parameters of which we understand the world to exist right now. And that's not, we just don't have the picture of what's going on.
Yeah.
And, I think you've done amazing work with this book over the years. I think you've done obviously you're on here with me, hanging out with a group like us. We're small potatoes in the grand scheme of things, but we have a very tight-knit group, a family over here that are very close. And, I know they appreciate being able to hear from you tonight.
My pleasure.
And obviously bringing this story forth. Who knows where it's going to go? Because I think that it's my guesstimation, I guess, at this point. I do think, I talk to my children about this stuff. I'm not necessarily planning the idea in their head, but if they bring it up, I talk pretty openly to them about maybe some of the things that are not normal, as it were, and that there might be a real day when there are, I tend to lean towards the idea that there's been things living here for a long time with us, very long time. And it's been the history as we understand it and what we were taught in school. It's not what we've been taught, and I know that's a hard pill for some people to swallow, but I think at a certain point, like you said, with everything that's come out with as much as I'm not a fan of the government, as it were, even at this point with what they're sharing, you're almost starting to stick your head in the sand if you're not at least acknowledging that something's going on. And I think, again, I'm not one of those guys who meditates or anything, but I think you can feel like a collective consciousness. You can feel like you were talking about the awakening or quickening. Something's changing, right? There's this awareness. And I'd like to think that you've been a great part of helping some of that for sure. And like I said, we really appreciate you coming and hanging out with us at the garage here. I know we only have about maybe I'll get you out here a couple minutes because we got SORs coming on. By the way, guys, if you want to check out Mr. Dave Scott tonight, he will have Bob Boston and Nicole Sackett, and they will be talking about Bigfoot and aliens. Is there a connection between Sasquatch and UAP? So if you guys want to go catch some quality content over there on the Spaced Out Radio, and like I said, you can catch myself, Gemma Jade, and John Hudson on the weekends. We'd appreciate that. And Mr. Ron Felber, if there is anything I have missed tonight, I do have your links in the show notes. But if there's anywhere else you'd like anybody to find you, and then once again, let us know what you're working on or anything that, and we'll get you out of here for the evening as well.
Yeah. Well, I mentioned before when I was a student at Georgetown in actually 1972. And I got to meet Bill Blatty while they were filming The Exorcist. And I had a new novel. My first novel. I was chasing him around. And we got to be friends. He liked the novel, said he'd help me with the next one. And he did. He was true to his word. We had a pretty much a lifelong friendship. But during the course of it, he passed along a very, very incredible story. And the name of the book that will come out in September is called The Unwelcomed, The Curious Case of Clara Fowler. And it's a case of demonic possession that was studied by Harvard University from 1898 to 1901. William James, the famous William James, whose brother was Henry James, a Harvard Medical School professor that sort of invented abnormal psychology, along with Dr. Morton Prince and George Waterman, and also Leonora Piper, who was the chief clairvoyant of the times, and the president of the Psychical Society, Research Society, formed a team to study this woman. And really, it was a battle between the spiritualists and the scientists as to whether this was a new disease or whether this was, in fact, a spirit that had occupied a human being. And this went on for 3 years. And it's probably the most incredible story I've ever come across.
I do. So essentially dealing with the possible, because we haven't read it, but a possible demonic demon possession, correct?
Yes.
And an exorcism. Yeah. So very interesting. I find that stuff highly intriguing. I think there's, again, to me, the world is so much more magical, for lack of a better term, than we give it credit for. Darn it, I get fired up.
One of the key lines that I thought, so Hodgson, who's president of the Psychical Research Society, talks to William James, who was a scientist, and says, "Don't you see the possibilities? here in Boston in 1898, if we can prove that a demon exists, we can prove that God exists. And we can prove that there's a life everlasting. That's what we're doing here today.
Interesting. That's quite the quote when you think about it. That's something there.
Powerful.
It is very powerful. Really quickly, too, guys, I am going to drop the link in the show notes here, in the chat. So if anybody wants to come and hang out, I'll be wrapping up the show. We're going to let Ron get out here, enjoy the rest of his evening in Florida down there. How is the weather down there? I've got what have I got here today? I got 11 degrees right now. What do you got down there?
About 68.
Oh my gosh, 68. Yeah, that's the life of Michigan, though. That's what we get up here. So, once again, thank you for everyone who has joined in tonight. And Ron, thank you for doing this. Maybe one day we'll get to meet in person, and I'll get a signed copy from you. I'll go for that. I'll bring it with me. So,
a lot of fun. Thank you.
All right, Ron. You have a good night. Everyone in the chat, as I always say when we're ending it, please stay curious and keep it weird.
Take care.